The king is back. Garry Kasparov is playing in an online rapid tournament organised by the St. Louis Chess Club. In fact, it's a Fischer Random tournament, or as they like to call it, a 9LX tournament. Nobody knows why. Anyway, on with this game. Alireza Firouzja, the 17-year-old prodigy, against Garry Kasparov, 57 years old. There's a 40-year age gap between these players. Firouzja with the white pieces. Now, have a look at this position. We've got two knights in the corner here. Bishops here, rooks here, and then king and queen. So, pretty weird lineup, but let's see what the players made of it. G3 from Firouzja, I think understandably wanting to open up this bishop at an early stage. D5. Kasparov claims some space in the centre and blunts this bishop. D4, okay, matching that pawn move. And G6, so symmetrical so far. Knight C3, attacking the pawn. C6 defends it, and knight B3. So the knights come into the game, and now potentially having played knight B3, protecting that D pawn, then E4 starts to become possible, and that'll claim space for white in the centre. So that's why Kasparov plays F5, controlling the E4 square. And now we have a kind of Dutch stonewall structure in front of us. If white wanted to be really tedious, then you could actually lock up the centre completely. I often see this in Fischer Random games, actually. I'm not suggesting this is a particularly good move, but it would kind of clog up play. But instead F3 from Firouzja. So he's perhaps still hoping to get in E4, and well, he's just protecting that square. But yeah, I think the main hope is to do this, and well, as we'll see, to free his queen a little bit as well. Knight C7. Knight comes into the game from the corner. And now E4 is possible, but I think black has a very solid position, and that's a bit awkward for the rook. So Firouzja, after knight c7, plays queen f2, and I think that's kind of prophylaxis. He's wanting to just prevent black from playing e5, because after this, then of course that a pawn would be on prise. So queen f2 played, and now Kasparov plays knight e6. So that stops that bishop coming to the nice square on f4, and also looks at this d pawn. Looks a bit funny to block the e pawn here, but still reasonable. Bishop d2, well, that's all about enabling castling. So I love it. Castling in Fischer Random is so weird. I'm going to do an action replay. So the king was here, and casting on the queen side just flips over the rook. So now that makes a break in the centre more possible now that the king is tucked behind those pawns. Knight b6, yep, looking at a good outpost on c4. King b1, so that allows the bishop just to tuck into c1 if it's attacked by the knight. And now queen f6, so Kasparov looking to castle himself. Bishop c1, knight c4, knight gets to this outpost. Rook e1, I mean the e4 isn't possible at the moment because there's a pin here anyway. But Kasparov now takes the time to castle. So there it goes. King and rook in their castle positions. So we've got kings on opposite sides of the board. That makes life interesting for everybody. It is possible to go back to this move f4 actually, and then look to perhaps break with g4. It's not so silly, particularly considering after f4 that knight wouldn't be in a very good position. But Firouzja plays queen g1. I think he's still hoping to get in e4. So he's taking his queen away from the f file, which would obviously open. And now Kasparov takes the initiative. He plays pawn to f4. He's not hanging around and waiting for white to play e4, and indeed that stops white playing f4 himself. So f4 looks to me very logical. It opens up this bishop's diagonal and also prevents e3, so that pawn is sort of cut off from the pawn on e2. So nice move f4. Pawn takes and knight takes. So you can see that that has liberated this bishop, and also the queen and rook look pretty good on the semi-open file. e3 drives the knight away, and knight h3. Knight doesn't have to go here, but that puts a little bit more pressure on white. Attacking the queen, queen g3, and now queen g5. I think this is a good idea. Basically, after that queen exchange, the knight will get back into play and opens up the rook as well. Rook f1 protects that pawn. Queen takes, pawn takes, and now e5. So Kasparov is the first one to get in that central pawn break. And at this moment, I think Kasparov would have been very happy with his position. Those pawns look a bit funny. They're not, none of them are protecting each other. Black's pieces look very good. The only thing that's slightly odd about Black's position is that knight on h3, although White can't exploit it for the moment. So the bishop attacks the pawn to f4. And here is an important moment in the game where Kasparov, well, he likes his and he put the bishop back on g7. That's his instinct and very understandable. Other players might have just taken this knight on c3, and I think this gives Black very easy play, let's put it like that. So, for example, in this position, you can see that, well, the players on the light squares basically here. Even if Black gets in e4, then that bishop really is still biting on the pawn on c6. The knight looks splendid on c4, and it's not possible to trap that knight. Even if the bishop comes here and the rook comes here, it can hop into f2. Now it's a bit scary with that knight sort of on the limb, on the side of the board on h3, but it could hop back into play. I think that's a practical way for Black to play, but I can understand why Gary wanted to put the bishop back on g7. And then he plays g5, so he wants to connect with that knight on h3. I mean, you could say this is a practical way for Black to play. He's making sure he doesn't lose that knight. And another interesting move here, knight a3 check, pawn takes and then bishop takes knight. I think, that's a reasonable way for Black to play, but Kasparov played bishop f5. And now Firouzja has a chance. He plays knight d4. And if that bishop moves to g4, then f5. But Kasparov took that and connected with the knight on h3. So that was obviously his main concern over the last few moves, that he wanted to make sure that that knight wasn't going to be lost. But actually, now White has a chance. Firouzja plays b3. Good move. The knight is driven back to d6. And the bishop comes into the game on a3. Kasparov steps out of the pin and plays rook, and Firouzja plays rook e5. So you can see that he's starting to get the initiative, starting to take control of the position, and that rook on e5 looks absolutely fantastic. Beautiful centralization. You've got to ask yourself, what's that knight doing on h3? But white doesn't have total control here. And Kasparov demonstrates that with the move h5, which introduces the possibility of creating a pass pawn with h4. This is quite a tense position. To my eyes, white certainly has the advantage here, but it's tricky. I like this move, bishop takes knight, because now there's no possibility of that knight hopping into e4, and that rook looks really secure. And a nice maneuver from Firouzja. He's going to bring the knight round to e3. Rook e6. Kasparov needs to challenge that rook. Knight e3. Good move. Looking at that blockading bishop. Rook takes, pawn takes. So a nice pawn chain and pressure on that bishop. Kasparov steps up with king g6. Still not so clear because of that pawn break h4. So it's a very tense situation. And here Firouzja decides to break up those pawns with c4. In fact, king c3 looks like a stronger move to put the king on d4. Just blockading and then maybe an advance is possible on the queen side. I imagine he was worried about this pawn break, but in fact the tactics work in white's favour. Here, for example, I mean this is tricky, but rook g1 check. King moves away and then knight takes bishop. So king c3 was the move. Actually, white has time here. But Firouzja was in a hurry. He played c4. But then d4. Excellent move. Knight takes, king takes, and rook e1. Now, I can imagine that Firouzja thought he was starting to take control here, because that bishop is about to check the king back. But h4 now takes the initiative. This is a really powerful move. I mean, one thing is it creates passed pawn, but also having knocked out the pawn on g3, then the pawn on f4 has been weakened. For example, if pawn takes pawn, then knight takes f4, and that g-pawn is rolling down the board. I mean, black has great control here, actually. The knight really dominates the position. White has a huge problem here. The king is way across the other side of the board. The king is in Siberia, and this is really where the action is taking place. So the king has gone back, and Firouzja is in massive trouble here. He tried f5 check. He can see that he's winning material. I mean, the king shouldn't fall back. Then the pawns look dangerous. But king takes, good move. Allowing white to win the rook with this discovered check. Let's see what happens. Bishop takes rook. In fact, it's even possible for Kasparov to take on g3 here, but well, he played very pragmatically. He simply took the bishop, and actually there is no defense to the advance of this g-pawn. For example, he takes g3, and this is actually winning. Firouzja tried instead rook e2, and after pawn takes rook g2, but now the king stepped up to support the g-pawn, and as before, that king is just way too slow. It can't get across. And Kasparov drove that g-pawn home. Let's see what happened. Knight f2. The rook hurried to get behind the g-pawn. Pawn to g2, but that was the final move of the game. Why did Firouzja resign? Well, if rook g7, then king f3, followed by slamming the knight in on g4. Just breaking the connection, and then the pawn will roll home on the next move. Wow. Kasparov back in action and posting a great win there against the 17-year-old. Absolutely superb. And to give Alireza credit, afterwards he tweeted, "I guess it's true that kings never die. Well played, Kasparov 63." Yeah, that's Kasparov's Twitter handle. Well, that's classy of Firouzja to say that. And yeah, kings never die. Well played, Garry Kasparov. Great to see him back in action, if only in a rapid play tournament and a Fischer Random tournament. But anyway, fantastic victory there. I should say that Kasparov managed to draw with Carlsen as well. Carlsen was better, but stumbled in an endgame. But Kasparov lost to Svidler. So Kasparov on 1.5 out of 3. At the moment, Carlsen and Dominguez sharing the lead with 2.5 out of 3. But anyway, great to see Garry Kasparov back in action. Look out for more from him. Thanks for watching.